most of them out here. And today we've got a video for you about the top 5 ways to exploit the AI in Necromunda Underhive Wars. Now, by now, if you've been playing the game, you've probably realized that the AI is pretty buggy. It's definitely got a tendency to bug out. It's a bit janky. It can make some suboptimal tactical choices. Now, obviously, a competitive and challenging game AI is a good thing because it increases the sort of value of our own strategic choices. It kind of validates our tactics if we can see them working against the challenging opponent. And I expect that Rogue Factor are aware of this problem and aware of the importance of this issue. But at least initially, we're going to see that they're going to focus on sort of real game-breaking bugs that actually crash the game or stop people from actually playing the game. So unfortunately, the AI issues are probably going to have to take a second fiddle to those problems and be a little bit later on. Yeah, I mean, although the AI issues are problematic, they're not literally game-breaking. So, yeah, if you're like me, you want the AI improvements as soon as humanly possible, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to exploit the hell out of those AI deficiencies in the meantime to level up your gang, get heaps of loot, get free kills on the funky AI, and generally get the most out of the situation that you can. And even after there's AI improvements, a lot of these tips are kind of general tips that apply to exploiting the AI in any single player strategy or tactical game. So I imagine a lot of them will still apply well into the future. So without further ado, here's my top 5 tips for exploiting the AI in Necromunda Underhive Wars. Tip number 1 is leave objectives on the map. There's the game's telling you to collect these resource barrels, these medical bags or nano cures or what have you. Just don't collect them. Just leave them on the map. The AI will often overvalue objectives, resource barrels, lights, etc. Especially in the first few turns of a match where there's no real need to be gathering resources, you can leave the collection of the resource barrels till the end of the match after the enemies are mostly destroyed. So just leave these on the map to confuse the AI. Basically, the more things that are going on, like the more choices that the AI has got to make, the more potential that it has to make the wrong decision. Also, another factor of this is that the AI will often prioritize looting the bodies of fallen gangers, even if it's their own comrades as well, and collect all of the items that are on the bodies. So this can be really handy for you for collecting stuff. Instead of you going around gathering the equipment of all of the fallen gangers, you just let the AI go around and waste their action points, collect everything, and then at the end you can just kill them and take all the stuff off their body after they've collected the loot off 3 or 4 different gangers and kind of condensed it all into the one area. Excuse me. Another aspect of this is that due to pathing errors, the AI will occasionally kind of beeline towards an objective, trying to pick up a resource barrel, for example, but be blocked by a pathing issue. It might be like the resources sort of sitting on top of a table on the far edge of the table facing away from the AI. So the AI kind of moves directly to the object, but the table's wide enough that it can't select it to grab it, and it's not smart enough to realize it has to vault over the table or walk around the table. So it can just kind of get stuck there. And so basically, just leaving resources on the map gives it more opportunity for the AI to try to do this, and the more confusing the environment is with the more objects and stuff for the AI to navigate around, the more likely they are to get stuck on that stuff. So yeah, so don't collect your resources early, leave them on the map, basically as bait for the AI to get stuck on, and let the AI collect all of the stuff for you, and then just kill the AI once they've gathered it up. Tip number 2 is if you see an enemy fighter that's potentially bugging out or is bugged out, or you see a fighter in a situation where you think there's a higher chance that they may bug out, just leave them to it. Don't distract the AI. The AI is likely to stay in the same kind of loop of decision making if you don't change the situation too much. So some of the situations might be if the AI is trying to get a resource crate or move to a certain position and it's stuck on the terrain. That one will happen occasionally. If you don't change anything about the situation, it might just keep trying to move to that bit of terrain and wasting its actions each turn. Another common one is if the AI character is on the other side of the map or on the other side of a wall or something, and they're going into Overwatch, or they're in an area where no one's likely to move through, but they're going into ambush stance, sort of essentially wasting their turns. Another one is if there's an enemy fighter and they're in the middle of a bunch of sort of different interactable objects. So there might be loot crates or resource barrels or enemy fighters that have been downed that still have loot on their bodies. All of these things are kind of very attractive for the AI, so they're likely to go and try and loot those bodies, pick up those resources, etc. And especially if the environment they're in has a lot of objects that they might have to navigate around in the terrain, there's a high chance they're going to either get bugged out or at least waste their action points in quite a suboptimal way. So if there's other fighters that are kind of near your fighters and likely to be able to get into melee combat with them, or they're going to be able to shoot at your fighters, and they're not so obstructed, you want to focus on those fighters first, and the other ones that are potentially going to bug out, just leave them alone, don't interact with them, and potentially they're going to be out of the fight for a while. Another point about things that potentially can bug out the AI are they don't seem to deal too well with destructible barriers. So sometimes you'll be in a fight where the AI is sort of on one side of a barrier, and the logical thing for them to do would be to use their heavy to destroy the barrier, so that they can attack you, but they won't, or they might have like 3 brawlers on the other side of the barrier that obviously want to be in melee combat, so they're going to be doing optimal damage, but instead they just stand on the other side of the barrier and shoot you with their pistols. So if you see that sort of situation, leave the barrier there. Obviously, just that's going to reduce the efficiency of the AI, because they're likely not going to be smart enough to destroy the barrier. So tip number 2: if you see the enemy's going to bug out, or that they are already bugged out, leave them to it. Go and focus on some of the other gang areas that are not as bugged out, that are potentially going to be more of a threat to you. Tip number 3 is used area-based sort of AoE debuffs and buffs. This is a bit of a theoretical one. It's not really confirmed, but it seems as though the AI has problems with different effects that affect certain areas. So, for example, if you've got a safeguard aura on your heavies, which makes the enemy player needs to use twice as many action points to attack them, then potentially the AI is moving into a position to attack your fighters either by shooting or with a charge or a melee attack, and then it gets closer and realizes that it doesn't have the action points that it needed to attack you, or it's got enough action points to attack once, but it was expecting to attack twice, and now it realizes it's not going to make it do as much damage, and so basically the AI decides to do something, but then something that you've done, an AoE or something, an AoE effect that applies to it, makes it need to recalculate. Another thing that I think can do it is saboteur grenades and AoE debuffs. For example, if the AI moves towards you to attack, and then it moves through a hallucinogen grenade or another grenade debuff, then it sort of has to recalculate because its stats are now different than what it was when it decided to make the attack. As I said, this one's sort of unconfirmed. There could be other factors. The AI might have just bugged out and gotten confused for some totally unrelated reason. Maybe it doesn't affect it at all. Also, road flares give you the plus 35% range resistance for Orlocks. So just all these sort of different sort of AoE buffs and debuffs on different areas. I think that kind of stuff can confuse the AI, but that's kind of unconfirmed. But anyway, that's tip number 3. Tip number 4 is to do with maps, map choices and map layouts, placements of your deployment zones, everything to do with maps. So basically, I've noticed that the AI can be sort of more janky on certain types of maps and less janky on other ones. So as mentioned previously, when there's a lot of kind of objects in the terrain, that can make the AI struggle more. So maps that are kind of more flat, especially where the AI is going to engage with the enemy, without before it sort of runs into as many terrain problems. those ones the AI tends to operate a bit better, whereas when the AI has to move around a lot and navigate through a lot of different terrain, obstacles, or like on the ground, and also navigate through different zip lines, elevators, that kind of stuff, there's just more potential for the AI to have to make decisions and struggle more. Also, when you're choosing a map, if there's a choice of a map that's got like an objective, there's a couple of ones. There's the merchants, the guilders put on these games type ones. There's ones where you do like arena battles, and there's ones where you have to activate these lights. Like the lights, the one where you activate the lights, obviously the AI is going to go crazy for the lights and try to activate them. So then it wastes its turns half the time moving to the lights and activating them. Also, if you're doing the battle ones where you place one fighter per activation, those ones, the AI actually kind of handles that okay, because it only has less fighters to deal with, and it seems to get less confused because there's less stuff going on. It's still definitely got potential to bug out, but yeah. But still, I think those type of ones, because you activate one, they activate one, you activate one, it's a very restricted kind of gameplay method. So there's more kind of, I think as a player you can probably exploit it better than the AI can, but anyway. But yeah, so you mainly want to be looking for ones that have lots of objectives. If they have an extra sort of objective type of setup, then that's the sort of stuff that can mess up the AI. Also, once you get into the map and you've set up your you're picking deployment zones and everything, if you're in a battle where there's two opponents, you obviously want to place yourself as far away as possible from the other two opponents so they can fight each other. Ideally, normally you want to probably pick the high ground, like whichever deployment is going to put you in the highest elevation, because it's always easier to go down than it is to go up. But the AI will generally always take the high ground as well, so you can sort of especially, this is why it's good advantage actually to have a low initiative warband. If you let the two AI, just say you're up against two enemies, you let the two AIs pick first. They'll pick the two highest ground positions, hopefully near each other, and then you pick a position that's the furthest away from them, and then you kind of just spend the first turn buffing yourself and getting ready. Let them have a free turn of hitting each other, and then and they'll usually be, and if they're close enough to each other, they'll usually be, slightly more efficient at killing each other, because they've got targets to immediately attack. Choose maps that have got special objectives that's more likely to screw up the AI. When you do your placement, if there's more than one enemy, place your fighters as far away as possible. If the AI ever splits their forces, you can look at how you can isolate you can attack the isolated gangers, and ideally, if you're in a battle where the two AI opponents are fighting, you just kind of hang around at the edges for the first couple of turns and pick off the stragglers, and then kind of join in on whichever side's winning, basically. That's not even an AI thing. That's just just obvious, I guess. So that's pretty much it with the maps. Just choose the maps where you think the AI is going to be more janky, and after a while you get used to it. You'll have played some of the maps in the past, and you'll kind of have an idea of which ones give the AI the most trouble. Also, base raids where they've got the barricades. If there's a lot of barricades on the map, as I mentioned previously, the AI struggles with barricades. So that's another thing to look out for. Tip number 5. So tip number 5 is a general tip. Basically, you want to try to force the AI to make more decisions. So basically, the problem with the AI is that it's bad at making decisions. Sometimes it makes good decisions, but more often than not, it makes bad decisions. So the more decisions that you can make the AI have to make, the more potential is for the AI to make a bad decision. An example of this is like if you go into, or an example of not doing this is if you have a melee fighter. So if you're facing a brawler that's got dual wielding or got a two-handed melee weapon, if you send two of your melee fighters into combat with that brawler in such a way that it's like locked in and can't get away, then the brawler is going to be forced to fight you in melee. So it doesn't have any other choice, you know. So the AI is quite likely to have the brawler actually attack you in melee and, you know, do damage to you. I mean, you might still beat the brawler if you're 2 versus 1, but if you had not blocked it in, for example, let it have a space to get away, the brawler may have decided to disengage and move away and change to a different weapon or something. Obviously, a human player would have realized that that's not necessarily the optimal thing to do, especially if it can potentially kill you in melee. But leaving that option open to the AI player, there's a good chance it might do it because the AI is a bit dumb. The other side of things is if like using a similar example, if the AI is has a two-handed ranged weapon, so it can't melee with you. If you lock that character in to melee by going into melee combat with one of you guys and then jamming into a melee so it can't move away from melee basically, then the AI is likely to then the AI needs to make a decision. Ideally, it needs to make a decision to change to a melee weapon, but it may not do that. It may decide to just stay in ranged and go into Overwatch mode or something, and essentially waste its turn because you're not going to be moving through its Overwatch radius if you're already in melee with it. So whereas if you left a room for it to escape, then the AI could potentially disengage and move back to a certain distance and then shoot you. If you give it more, so basically you want to either give it more options or don't give it any options, depending on whether it's currently doing something wrong. If it's currently doing what you don't want it to be doing, then try to limit its options. And if it's currently doing something that you don't want it to do, then give it options. Yeah, if that makes sense. So basically the AI struggles. The more options the AI has got, the more potential it's got to stuff things up. The other sort of aspect of this is on the sort of more strategic level. As you get more advanced in the game, there's more options. As you get more skills, you've got more activatable abilities. You've got your gang is a little higher level. So basically, as you get higher up, you're more likely to be choosing good skills than the AI is. So you're as a human player, you're going to choose a bunch of skills that operate together in a good way that are going to make your gang extremely powerful. Whereas the AI is unlikely to do that. It's much more likely to choose a bunch of random skills that don't have any synergy with each other. So that's one thing. And the other aspect of it is that the AI is just going to have more options, and that means it's got more options to do something wrong. So if an AI's got a brawler character and it's got a ranged weapon, but the brawler's also got all these like war cries and melee related skills and everything, self buffs and things, it's going to have more chance of just firing off some inappropriate buff that's not relevant to what it's doing. When the characters are very low level and they can only just sort of shoot or reload, then they're going to either shoot or reload. There's less chances for them to do the wrong thing. So as the game sort of gets harder, there's sort of more options for the AI to bug out and make stupid decisions. So hopefully with these 5 tips, you'll be able to pretty much negate the difficulty of the whole game and dominate brutal and even deadly missions pretty easily, and level your gang up really fast, which will kind of make it easier because the AI will sort of become a bit even more janky as it gets up to high levels, and conversely your gang will become like nearly indestructible once you figure out how to synergize all of your skills and maximize your damage and all that kind of thing. Okay, so those were my 5 tips for how to exploit the AI in Necromunda Underhive Wars. Now, I've just got a few final notes about it. One thing I was going to say is don't always expect the AI to be dumb. At higher levels, the AI can put out a lot of damage. They can have, when they've got tier 5 weapons, they've got like skills that can modify their damage and make them quite deadly. And even with the bad AI, they can get a lucky hit into you, and occasionally you get a string of good decisions by the AI. It's kind of like RNG, it's RNG whether the AI is going to be good or bad this turn. But you can't kind of always rely on the AI being bad every turn. You know, sometimes you'll have a string of 2 or 3 activations where the AI will actually do something really deadly and dangerous to you with 2 or 3 of its fighters successively in a row. You know, like as a human player, you can plan out your actions that you're going to activate this guy that's going to take the enemy fighter down to 40% health. Then this guy's going to come in, get the enemy fighter down to 0 or down to 10% health, and you've got this third one that's going to finish off the enemy fighter. You know, the AI is not going to do that very often. It's going to get distracted. It's going to get your guy down to 30% health and then forget to finish him off with another character and that kind of thing. But not always. Every now and again, the AI just kind of pulls it all together and pulls off some devastating series of attacks on you. So the game is still fun, and it does still have a sense of danger, depending on how well you follow these tips. If you follow all of the tips that I've given you above, you will kind of negate all of the difficulty of the game, and it'll probably be quite boring for you after a while. It'll be quite fun for a while at first, but it might start to get a bit boring after a while. But you can kind of like follow. You can use some of these tips here and there without going to that degree. Also, I just wanted to say, with regards to the AI, this game is really complex, I think, for the AI, and there's a huge amount of things for the AI to take into account. I actually find it kind of fascinating watching the AI and trying to figure out what it's thinking. It actually seems to do some quite clever things sometimes, but I think there's just too much going on in Necromunda for it to cope. So, you know, it occasionally makes really good decisions and does really interesting things, but a lot of the time it sort of looks like it's going to do something useful and interesting, and then it just does something really stupid instead. So I think it's I think there's obviously a lot of opportunity for the AI to go wrong, but make no mistake, like, the AI is thinking. It's trying to figure out how to wreck you, and occasionally it actually works. One last thing I wanted to mention as well is, if you're really disappointed with the AI and you really want more of a challenge, there are some things that you can do to kind of avoid the downfalls of the AI, I guess. But I guess the short version is do the opposite of everything that I said in these 5 tips. So, you know, try to limit the amount of choices that the AI has to make and limit the amount of bad choices that they have to make. One of probably the most straightforward things you can do is make a melee gang. So I've got a Goliath's gang called the Pit Lords, and they're melee focused. Everybody's got melee weapons. Everyone's got melee skills. They do have ranged weapons as well, but we're primarily focused on melee, and that makes the game a bit more exciting because it's a lot more dangerous. A lot of these tips that I explained, they work a lot better with a ranged warband, because you can kind of sit back and let the AI kind of get confused and get jumbled up with the other AI players and just kind of like destroy itself. Whereas if you play a melee warband where you have to get up close and personal, which tends to get the attention of the AI fighters, they're more likely to attack you if you're closer to them and closer than other enemy fighters that they potentially could attack, or closer than other objectives that they could go for. Then you're going to be in more danger. Which is not to say that the AI is going to suddenly become really good. It's still going to do stupid things. It's going to run past you and grab an objective when it shouldn't, and attack somebody else in a non-optimal way when it should attack you and stuff. But yeah, if you're disappointed in the level of challenge and you want more challenge, I think going for a melee warband is something that's going to make it a bit more challenging, and basically just doing the opposite of all of these tips. So that was my video about top 5 tips on how to exploit the AI in Necromunda Underhive Wars. Next video will probably be a video about the buff stacking and sort of must-have buffs and sort of must-have skills, I guess, for your for different team compositions, and maybe talk a little bit about certain character setups. Then probably after that, I might do a video about the house variants of the different skills, and what each house is kind of can specialize in terms of their specific skills that they get. So subscribe if you're interested, and check those videos out when they come out. That's all I got for now. Thanks, guys.